Hi again, everybody. We're still in chapter 2 at the moment, but I wanted to provide you with a bit of a supplementary lecture here and slideshow which accompanies it, so hopefully you are able to access that and you can follow along, because I'm sort of looking at these slides as I talk to you. But the reason why I'm doing this is because one of the things that I've gotten from students over the years, teaching classes on archaeology, theory, methodology, this sort of introductory lessons about how we do archaeology and how it tells us things about the past. One of the main questions I get from people is, why are we studying theory? Why does that make any difference? Why don't we just go dig in the dirt? Well, I explained in context of the way the book presents it, that facts don't just speak for themselves. Facts are just facts. Numbers in a spreadsheet or in a database don't do anything on their own. We have to tease out some sort of a narrative about what that means for people in the past. That's the same for even looking at data from today. If you have tables and tables of medical information on people in this country, what does that tell you? Nothing. What you've got to do is you've got to query that. You've got to say, okay, what about, why don't I sort out how many people have this particular pathology, and if there's anything in terms of a geographical distribution. Maybe we can find a source for how people are getting cancers because they're in close proximity to particular types of sources of carcinogens. That can actually then provide you with some answers and some stories you can tell about maybe how things happened, causality, what happened in what order. So the archaeological information is, we've already established, archaeologists are not treasure hunters. We're not just looking for the objects because they're pretty. We're not looking for ancient sites because it's exciting to do that. The thing that sets us apart, an archaeologist apart from a looter or a vandal, is the fact that we are approaching the extraction of this information in a scientific way that we can make use of it to try and more accurately depict the past. We looked at some of the challenges of that in this chapter 2 as well, that is there an objective past? Is there an objective present? Is my perspective, which is different from your perspective, more valid, less valid, equally valid way of describing things? And what is it that an archaeologist or someone who talks about the past, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to create a total truth? This is exactly what happened. Or are they trying to depict different perspectives from the past, ways that people saw them, like an anthropologist would do today in terms of cultural relativism and the emic approach rather than the etic approach? Well, these all are valid ways of doing it. There is some objective truth to the fact that things like climate changes, or there are droughts, or there are certain environmental factors. Those are facts, and those things change through time. The question is, how did that affect people? Well, you might see this fact as causing something else. That may or may not be the case, or it may be more complicated than just a monocausal, this thing begets this other thing. So it's complicated. And that's why I wanted to have this supplementary explanation of what the book talks about, but as a way to explain a little bit more fully why we're looking at theory and why we're doing this approach, because it may be mystifying to you. Why are we studying Karl Marx and Marxist views of history in archaeology? Well, it's actually extremely important, and I hope to explain that here a little bit better. So I have this slideshow that starts out by saying why societies change. Now, archaeology, I explained in the chapter 2 lecture that archaeology doesn't do a really good job of depicting what somebody's day-to-day life was like. Sometimes we get those little hits. Sometimes we get those little glimpses into somebody's life. But as a general rule, we get little data points that we can put together to create a broader picture. And that broad picture doesn't really help us that well with somebody's daily routine. I mean, we can get little bits and pieces of that, but that's not the strength of archaeology. Archaeology is more, in that sense, like sociology. Big data creates big pictures, and very importantly, there's that third dimension, or fourth dimension, I should say, which is time. Archaeology deals with time really well. We saw that in vertical excavations. Horizontal excavations are important to figure out what's going on at any particular period, but where archaeology really has its strength is we have the benefit of verticality. We can look at changes through time, and sometimes over great lengths of time. So if you have enough data, you can actually create sort of a general picture of what life was like for an entire community or set of communities, and how deep time actually affected that, or what took place in terms of social changes through time. That's the strength of archaeology. And you see this depicted, I've got another slide here, that archaeology looks at the past, but archaeology treats the past as a material place, some place you can go to, and the traces of it that are left behind that are material, you can analyze. That includes texts. So things that are written down is a material remain from the past. But it must be treated in the same context as a piece of rubbish that's left behind from the past. They all are part of that big picture. Now, why is a piece of rubbish that somebody dropped and left behind the same importance as an explicit document saying, here's what I think about the past? Well, the reason why is because it's about honesty here. Everything that's ever been written down was written down for a purpose. Now, that purpose is probably not to tell a future archaeologist what the truth about the past. And even if that were the case, how can we trust that person or rely on that person to be accurate? I wouldn't trust one person from my city here in Las Vegas to tell me the entire story of Las Vegas. I would want to get multiple perspectives, right? So even if there is an explicit acknowledgement that I am trying to document things for future benefit, we can't necessarily rely upon that message. The other thing is that there's almost certainly some motive for writing this down, and that can be to manipulate things in the present or manipulate things in the future. So it's a data piece, but it's not the only thing that we archaeologists rely upon. History is explicitly textual based, but archaeology is a little bit more circumspect and looks at the broader picture. Now, I said honesty. A piece of rubbish that somebody leaves behind is honest. It doesn't tell you very much, but at least it's real. There's no manipulation, or at least there's very little manipulation by people from the past. You've got to be really, really foresightful to be someone from an ancient culture that says, I think 2,000 years from now, someone might be investigating my pile of rubbish, so I'm going to play around with it and manipulate it, and so that I can trick that person. Nobody thinks that way. So the material objects from the past are usually more honest than textual references from the past. But if you go back far enough, there is no such thing as textual references. Writing was invented at some point, so before that, you don't even have the benefit. So what do we do about those earlier cultures? So archaeology looks at and breaks down the past into periods of time, just like history does. But we also have prehistory, that is before the written before writing, before the written language, that we also break down into periods of time. Now, we're looking at the past, and it's rich and complex and detailed and hard to know. So this is a tough job, right? To try and get it right, and that's why we build up all the little pieces to try and get at least a fair glimpse at the past. And on the second slide on my slideshow, you'll see I've actually borrowed just off the internet a really terrible timeline. But you're familiar with these sort of things. The reason why it's pretty terrible is because there are some dates in here, but they're big glosses and things. They even misspell the word ancient. They forget the N. So I chose something that actually is really bad. It's not good. I don't want you to use this timeline. We're going to actually create our own timelines. We're going to talk about this. But you notice that the reason why I put this up here is because time in the past is broken up into blocks. That if everyone's checking your watches and you're in, okay, we're in the ancient age, everybody, okay, now we're medieval. Okay, now good, we're in medieval. And we do everything that medieval people do. Oops, wait, sorry, times changed. We're now in the modern age and we're doing stuff that modern people do. I don't want to come down too hard on this particular timeline, but I mean timelines in general are ways for us to simplify what is a really complex process full of human beings that are complex. So it's up to us to try and interpret the data, the material remains from the past, to try and say some general things about the way people lived their lives, and importantly, how people's lives changed through time. Now, we're living in some changing times, but how is it possible for us to know that maybe 2020 or whatever year we're living in is the turning point, if that were the case? How would we know that in real time? We can't. So it's important for archaeologists to understand how social change happens in a real situation, because we're trying to apply our knowledge and our understanding of the way humans work to situations from the past. So social science in general has to be a tool for the way that we interpret the archaeological remains. And so that brings us to Marxism. Now, some of you may be familiar with Karl Marx and his writings. He was an activist. He was someone who promoted communism in a pure philosophical form. I think that if he were to have seen the political outgrowths of communism in some of the applications in the 20th century, he would have been appalled by what he saw. That isn't really Marxism that you see in places in communist countries. The Soviet Union wasn't, they said they were going for Marxism, but that was actually just sort of a gloss for totalitarianism and state control by an elite party system. That's not what Marxism is. Karl Marx was, and this is important to know, he was originally trained as a classicist. Now, this is before the discipline of archaeology had officialness, right? So there was no archaeology departments he could go to. He was in one of the closest things too, which was classics, which studied ancient Greece and Rome. And so he studied the past. He was a historian and a classicist. And that's how he got started. And he saw in his studies at the University of Bonn, he saw that time moved through stages, is what the way he looked at it. And this was quite common in the 19th century. People looked at the word evolution was being used in social context long before Darwin brought it up in terms of the evolution of species. We were already talking about evolution of society. And so Marx was in good company talking about how social groups and organizations moved through different stages. They had seen it in Europe, where the feudal system had collapsed and capitalism started to come to the forefront. And so he broke this down as a philosopher and a social theorist into how do we look at the past? And he looked at, okay, how do we look at the present? And he described the capitalist system that he was working in terms of how do you produce the stuff that you need to provide to survive, right? That you have means of production, which is the tools, the technology, the things like he saw factories, and those are the things that produce the stuff that you need to survive. So as a historian and classicist, he would have looked at something like an arrowhead, and he would have said, okay, we don't really use arrows for our production today. People hunt and that sort of thing, but it's a minor part of your economy, right? We're not a hunting based economy. We're producing things in factories and big giant farms with big owners who own acres and acres and acres, right? We're not a hunting and gathering society. And so he saw that the tools and the technology, the means of production, as he called it, reflected the social organization around that society that used those tools. So the organization of a hunting and gathering society that uses arrows and baskets is going to be a different social organization than an agricultural or industrial economy that has ownership and property and corporations and international trade. The social organization is going to be different. The government's going to be different. The social ranking and system is going to be different. You're going to have classes. And so he saw that the past actually could be reflected, the objects from the past would reflect in some way the social system that existed at that time. So something as simple as a material object is not just put into this mosaic of other material objects, but once you have all of those material objects out there, it tells you something about the way people in the past organized themselves as a society. And that's really important. So these means of production is the point that archaeologists find in the dirt. That is what they get, is the material objects. You find an arrowhead, and if you find nothing but arrowheads on your site, then you can probably assume that hunting was a big part of their lifestyle. Based on that, you can then start to surmise things like ethnographic examples that you can see today. How does a hunting and gathering society organize themselves? Well, here's what we think. If that's the case, then that society in the past probably organized them in that way, and we can test it. But if you find a plowshare, a metal object that was on a plow, they were probably growing crops. They were probably had fields, and they were cultivating domesticated crops. So that's a different type of means of production, which then requires, if you are an agriculturalist, if you're a farmer, you've got to have a farm, you've got to have land, and you've got to protect it, which means you've got to have property, which means you might need to have some protection for you're spending your whole time growing crops. You might need to hire somebody to protect your land, or you might need some cooperation with people, a government, some sort of a rules and regulations that protect your investment in your property. You can't just pick up sticks and move to the next valley over if somebody threatens you. You've invested all your time in that land, in that property. So the social organization, when you find a plow, is different than the social organization you would find with an arrowhead. So there are some issues with Marx's means of production, modes of production, and also his historical materialism. He saw that communism was the kind of the end of history, which is a teleological sort of putting the cart before the horse type of description. There are critiques you could make about Marxism, but historical materialism, there's something to that, right? And means of production and modes of production are still a valid way of creating that connection between objects and the culture that used them. Now, I mentioned in the description of Chapter 2 that Christian Thomsen, who was a Danish museum collector, he did a very similar thing. And he saw that the technology of stone, bronze, and iron were of different stages that were moving through time. And he saw that there were different social organizations in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And so this was something that we were moving towards in the 19th century. In the 20th century, though, as we started to get more and more data, we realized that we still use stones, right? We're not beyond stones. We're still in the Stone Age. We just have added things to that. In the Bronze Age, they still use stone. In the Iron Age, they still use stone, but they also still use bronze. We still use iron. So where do you find these cutoffs? Well, maybe there aren't cutoffs. And this ladder motif where you move from this stage to that stage to this stage to that stage through revolutions and changes that are irreversible, that may not be the case. And some social theorists, archaeologists started to propose maybe rather than a ladder, it's more like a ramp, or maybe even a sort of a varying, undulating ramp. Because there are things like, what about cultures that don't want to change? They're not forced to. We aren't really just checking our watches to see whether we're in the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. There's social conservatism that can delay change. And maybe one village is precocious and moves faster, and maybe another one is really conservative and holds back. And they're moving at different paces of social change, even though they're contemporary. Even though they're existing at the same time, the pace of social change is variable. And maybe you've got some that have got hybridity, ones that have got, I've got a picture here of an Amish woman who's rollerblading. Okay? That clearly means that she's not living in the 18th century, because she's got rollerblades. And so this is something archaeologists have got to come to grips with, that the pace